Everybody, it's almost the top of the hour. Just going to wait just a couple more minutes for folks to join, and then we're going to introduce Dan for the next session. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Glenn.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us, Dan. You guys sound great and look great. Just want to let you know that you are live and you can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Excellent.
Dan, let me introduce you. And then it's my understanding you've got a slide deck, right? You're going to go through?
I do, yeah.
So we'll turn it over to you for a few minutes, then I'll pop back on for some Q&A after you're finished with your basic presentation points. So first, I want to thank CoBank for allowing you to join us today, for the water infrastructure team, for supporting this conference, for supporting our organization from the start. Thanks to Tom Halverston for what he does for our organization, what he does for Delco Water, my specific organization, for the money that you loaned to us and the great interest rates we're getting right now. We appreciate that very much. So Dan Kowalski is an economist and the vice president of CoBank's Knowledge Exchange division. He leads a team of economists that produce research for the ag and the infrastructure industries and also global economies that affect rural America. So prior to joining CoBank in 2011, Kowalski worked as an economic consulting firm, provided research and advisory services to the food and ag industries. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Delaware, a master's degree in ag from the Penn State University. We are Penn State, right? The Nittany Lions. And sorry about your football team this year, but
yeah, that's right. They're pretty terrible.
Far into those weeds. And he's certainly engaged on working on his MBA. So with that, I'm going to stop my camera and step in the background, and we're going to turn it over to Dan while he shares his comments with you about the economy. And thanks again for being with us here today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Glenn. Let me see if I can figure out exactly how to share my screen here. I think I can. Let's see, and it's midstream here. Hopefully you can all see that. And I will start from the beginning. All right. Well, thanks everybody. It's great to be with you. I've been tuning in yesterday and today. It's been a great panel of folks that talked about a lot of really important things and a great expertise. So I'm honored to be part of this. I want to talk about sort of the economy, where it is now and where it's headed over the next several months. And, the obvious point of interest for everyone is the election and the results of that and where we're going. But really, we need to start where we are right now. And that's obviously being heavily impacted by what's happening with the health crisis that we have now with COVID. And, it's most of you are watching this every day. It's hot in the news. It's really important. And it's impacting a lot of lives very personally. So we're right up at the top with increasing cases, setting, records over the last few days. Hospitalizations just hit a new record yesterday. And then the death rates are rising above the second peak that we had back in late summer. So all signs point to a pretty tough next 2 to 3 months. And that's what the scientists are telling us too, that it's going to get worse before it gets better, which is not terribly comforting with Thanksgiving coming up next week and Christmas just a few weeks after that. So many of us are probably that live far away from our families are probably not going to see them or have to be very careful when we do. So that's going to impact the economy in a pretty big way. A lot less travel, probably less spending on gifts, less of a lot of things, less food, So in general, just over the holidays, you're going to see challenges. But, in normal life, just outside of those holidays, before and after, going into the depths of the winter, it's going to be challenging for people that are really stuck inside with nowhere to really go and feel comfortable. Restaurants will struggle again. So it's going to be challenging for the next few months. And the Biden administration is getting ready for that. They are well aware of what they're walking into, and that is going to be their primary focus when they get into office. So a little bit on what impact that's really had on employment. So we've seen jobs plummet by about 20 million. So 20 million people lost their jobs almost overnight. We've clawed back about half of those. It's now at about 54% if you count in what we reclaimed in October. But as you can see, we dropped off a cliff. We had a pretty good, almost V-shape coming out for a few months, and then we've really kind of laid over towards the right, and that's kind of what you expect. It's what most economists were projecting, that we'll have a pretty good bounce when most economies start opening back up. You can only ask people to stay home for so long and not go anywhere and close down businesses before you have real chaos. You have people that just refuse to do it. And you also have businesses that are going to start to go out, just not be able to survive. So that's basically what you saw early on in the rebound. But as time went on, you're gaining back fewer and fewer jobs. There's just some industries and some businesses that are just not operating, and they won't be, certainly not near full potential until we get back to something close to normal, which is still a ways off, unfortunately. So this is, we've made great progress, but we still have a long way to go, is basically that story. All right, so some perspective. If you look at other recessions, what does 2020 look like relative to some of these other recessions, in 1981 and so on? Well, it looks very, very different, obviously, and for the large part, the reason for that is that this is not really a recession. This is a natural disaster that hasn't happened in over 100 years, and it's obviously for that reason going to look very different. So in this chart, you can see the V shape quite a bit more clearly when you compress the time. This chart goes out to 5 years rather than just a few months. And you can look at this and say, well, this is actually absolutely very depressing, or you could look at it and say, well, this is kind of encouraging, depending on how you look at it, if it's half glass full or empty. So you could see that the impact on employment was much, much worse in 2020 than it was in previous recessions, even in the great financial crisis that we experienced in 08, 09. But you can also see we bounced back an awful lot faster. So just looking at the time frames here, we're back to where the great financial crisis was at the depths. Okay, so that's not very encouraging. That actually sounds pretty terrible, because we all lived through that, and we know how rough it was for 2, 3, 4 years until we started to get some legs under the economy. But you could also say, well, it took 2 years to get to that point. We got back to that point. We actually bottomed out in about a month, not 2 years, and then we were able to get back halfway, within 7 months, whereas the Great Recession took about 4 years to recover back half of what it had lost. So, it's been very difficult through the entire pandemic to try and compare this to anything, and that's why we've seen, really from early on, I refused to forecast GDP or unemployment rate, anything like that, because the ranges of what the models were spitting out were so broad, it made no sense to try and do it. And, of course, economists are expected to do it. We had numbers that were out there. And, of course, we overshot some things and undershot other things. And it was kind of a mess. But fortunately, most of the things through the early fall, most of the variables and the indicators that we watch, we actually outperformed. And so things were actually better than what we expected. So there has been some reason for optimism. And that's in large part thanks to what we did very, very early on. So this chart gives you an idea, visually, what we did with the CARES Act back in April into May. So the Congress approved and the president approved a $2 trillion spending bill very early. in the pandemic, and that made all the difference for the economy. Obviously, we're still struggling with the health impacts, but the economy's been able to survive, and in some cases, I won't say thrive, but in some corners of the economy, they're doing quite well and doing okay. So if you look at the dotted blue line, that's what personal income would have been if we didn't have government transfers and we didn't spend the money that we did. So that's actually pretty rough. You're getting down there close to 10% decline in personal income. Would have been pretty terrible. In reality, we actually had personal income bounce about 12% above where it was pre-COVID. And we've stayed above that, above pre-COVID levels all the way through. And we're stair-stepping down, which is exactly what you want your policy to do. As the impacts of the crisis get less severe, you want to have your policy kind of align with that. So we're still 3 or 4% above where we were in February on real personal income, which is why you've seen consumer spending bounce back so much. It's not quite back to where it was, but it's closed the gap an awful lot. So this has been the driver for the economy's recovery. Almost, I would say at least 90% of the recovery is right here. All right, so what is, again, some perspective. What does it look like, what we've done for the economy in 2020 relative to some other really, really bad recessions that lasted a while? Again, the great financial crisis is a good place to look. World War II was a whole lot of things going on, not just the economy. So on a GDP, relative to GDP, we spent in 2020, now we're out of the 2020 fiscal year, we're into 2021. But we've spent, in that year, basically our budget deficit was negative 16. So we spent 16% of GDP. GFC, the Great Financial Crisis, it was negative 10. So, we've spent an awful lot more to tackle this thing, and I think there's very few, if any, economists that would agree with you that was not the right, that was not the right call. Most economists rallied around in the spring and said, you've got to go big, including the Fed. They were very clear. The Fed made their own big moves, which helped us, bridge the gap, settle the financial markets, and really get us back to a semblance of new normalcy that we were able to establish in the early summer. So that gives you a sense of where we were, what we did. So what happened with the money that we spent, that the government spent? We spent over $2 trillion. A lot of that went to direct to people's pockets. There was a study that was done here not long ago looking at a variety of different data sources, what actually happened to that stimulus money. And actually, it was split pretty broadly amongst 3 categories. So, of course, you would expect people to spend it because people that are out of work got most of this stimulus. So a reminder that, the stimulus mostly came in 2 forms. You had $1,200 checks that came to people, basically anyone. You didn't have to lose your job. It came to everybody that made a certain level of income. So there was a lot of people in that category. Then the second thing was people that were out of work. They got state unemployment checks, but then they got the federal $600 on top of that. So for a lot of people, that was big money. They were actually making more money while not working than when they were working. So between those 2 things, that added up, well over $1 trillion. There was other spending that went into this, but it was a big impact on personal income. So people spent 42% of it. They didn't need to spend all of it. Those people that were already living within their means, didn't lose their job, got those $1,200 checks. That was, for a lot of them, there was a concern that something was going to go wrong. They didn't know how long this was going to last. Was I going to lose my job? So a lot of them saved their money. So you could see 27% of people saved that cash, and then another 31% paid down the debt. So probably a lot of these people kind of split it up in one way or another, but that's how it came out in aggregate. If you look at the chart, you can see that the blue is basically what income was. And so we saw income decline dramatically, which we would expect. But again, big numbers from the stimulus. We saw over $3 trillion being added to that stimulus. So if you average them out or subtract one from the other, you're actually seeing personal income higher by about $2 trillion in the early days of the pandemic. And again, here's your stair step coming down to where we are now, which basically we're more or less back with personal income levels. We're back to where we were around February. And so if you look at those little white circles, that shows you kind of the total, if you were to average or compensate out, do the subtraction from the down, the decreases in compensation, sort of those down sections that you see below zero, you take those out of the positive sections above zero, and that's where you end up with that circle. So I look at all this and explain it to say, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, what's going on in Washington right now, what's happening between Republicans and Democrats and people that really are in the throes of this, trying to figure out what should we spend? Should there be a second bill? You know, I try to stay totally pragmatic and unpartisan. This is almost exactly what I would think a lot of folks are looking at in Washington as they're trying to make a decision. When you see the Republicans saying, you know what, the economy's done really well, it's staged a bigger comeback than what we expected. You know, we probably only need a few $100 billion. We don't need $2 or $3 trillion, because they're looking at this and saying, you know, how bad is going back to February levels? This seems relatively sustainable. We got a vaccine coming. We got a few vaccines coming. We can bridge this. We don't need a ton of money. The Democrats, on the other hand, are saying that is absolutely not true. If you look at some of the other, I'm not sure I have the slides in here, but if you look at the other unemployment categories and you say, gosh, we have, you know, long-term unemployed is skyrocketing. A lot of people that were out of work in March and April are still out of work. Their unemployment benefits are falling off right now. And there's a benefits cliff coming at the end of this year. A lot of the Federal Reserve programs that were set up in the springtime are set to expire if we don't change something there. The Fed will probably take care of those. But there are other programs that were set up by Congress that are going to expire at the end of the year, and we need to get something done. This is a false show of optimism, or this is false hope for what we will see in the first quarter of 2021. So those are the two arguments that are happening in Washington, the two different schools of thought. And so you can see how reasonable people can view this very differently, because the data does not tell you exactly what to do. It tells you where we are and where we've been. Okay, so personal savings rate, this is just kind of harkens back to this pie graph, right? So if 27% of what people were given in stimulus was saved, and you know, frankly, I'm sitting at home because my wife has, potential, health potential of getting COVID, pretty severely, and there's millions of other people like me that are like, you know what? If it's outside, I might go out to eat. If it's not, I'm probably not, and I don't really want to go shopping. I don't really want to go to the movies. I don't want to do all these things. I'll go to the grocery store maybe once every 2 weeks instead of once every 4 days. That changes things, and so people, one, aren't spending on, some of the same products that we would have spent on. We're trading off, and there's a chart that I don't think I have in here also, but we're buying very different things in the pandemic. So we are still spending, but we're buying different things. It's really the services, the activities that we've enjoyed, that we spend a lot of our disposable income on, typically, that we're not spending on now. So typically our consumption, the US consumer on average spends about somewhere between 66 and 70% of their disposable income on services, and then about a third to maybe a little bit less, a little bit more on goods. And so that's a big deal when your services are the things that people really can't get to and they don't feel safe going to do anymore. So all of that to say, here we are, we had savings go up to an astronomical number, around 35%, and then we saw it fall precipitously down to about 14, 15%. But still, historically, you look back to 1960, that's a really high number, especially looking back over the last 10, 20 years. So people have a lot of cash to spend. And if this is kind of foreshadowing, if we get out into the first and second quarter of next year, and we do feel some protection from the vaccines what we have, which will probably actually not come until the second quarter for most folks, there's a lot of pent up demand here. There's a lot of people that can't wait to go out and do the things that they used to do. So there is some held back demand here and some capital that's going to be deployed into the economy over the next 6 months. And so there's some reason to be optimistic there. This is what I referred to a little bit over just in the last slide about services and goods. We are spending actually more on goods today than we were pre-pandemic. because we need to be entertained, right? We're not going out to do things. We're not doing activities. We're not enjoying as many dinners out. We're not going to see live music or, going to baseball games or all the things that we love to do. We're not doing it. So we're trying to make ourselves comfortable at home. There's a limit to what we can do with that. And that's why you're seeing the flattening out of that curve. We kind of bounced up. People bought a bunch of stuff for home offices and, maybe some new gadgets and, want to have something to do at home. But, there's diminishing returns on after a while of buying things. We just, can only get so much enjoyment out of them. So that's the situation. We've got to climb back out of the services problem, which is really not going to be solved by policy. Over the medium to long term, we've got to get the health crisis under control. So on the GDP, this gives you a sense. The green and red arrows are really simple. This is the first half of 2020 was terrible, largely because of mostly the second quarter. The third quarter was really good. We got our legs back under us in, really shortly after really it started halfway through the second quarter, and then the third quarter was quite good as well. But what does that mean now going forward? So, the baseline right now, this is kind of a general baseline. This is from Oxford Economics, when we subscribe to their data, but you could look at, a number of different forecasters. You could look at Moody's, you could look at S&P. A lot of folks are coming in right around the same level here. The light blue, if you will, the kind of the shaded area is where it was projected a couple months ago leading up to the election, trying to piece together what exactly Trump's plan would be for the economy, and what his policies would do to the economy. And that was kind of the lower end of that blue is what you would see from what they call Trumponomics. The upper end of that blue, which is basically just a lot more spending from Biden's plan, is the upper end of that light blue section. The dark blue line is basically where we are now, with the understanding that we will likely have a split Congress. We won't know, as Brent was talking about just a little while ago. But it's likely. That's the baseline, the base case scenario right now, is that we're going to have a split Congress. Spending is going to be much more limited, and therefore, whereas if the model was correct, we probably would have gotten back to the trend line that we were on pre-COVID by somewhere in 2022, because we just would have spent that much money that would have churned the economy and got it going again as soon as we could get out into the open in 2021. And in 2022, we would just have momentum behind us. That's not the path that we're on right now. This looks much more like the Congressional Budget Office's path, which tells you really that those lines actually connect out in somewhere in 2028, 2029. Now, there's no way we can project out that far and tell you with confidence what's going to happen between now and then, but that does show you the difference, when we model these things, what the difference is from spending a lot of money right up front and the multiplier effect that can have over a few years versus waiting or spending, just spending less, or spreading it out over time so that it doesn't have the stimulative effect up front. So this is what it looks like. We're probably going to have a pretty rough Q4 for a lot of the things that I talked about, related to COVID and lack of a spending bill that's probably not going to come during the lame duck session. They could surprise us. We could get something in the range of $500 billion, which is kind of where the Republicans in the Senate were prior to the election. And now President Trump is still coming out and saying, I want to go big on this. So there might be room for agreement. It kind of comes down to how will the Democrats strategize here now? And that's a big question. I don't think there really is an answer to that. I don't think there's a strategy formed yet as to whether they should play ball, go small right now, and then go, add on to that, anticipating that the Republicans in the Senate will play ball later in, January, February. I'm no political strategist, so I'll leave that to them, but I'm not, we'll see. We might get some now and some later. That's a possibility. The Fed, so this leads us kind of into the Fed, and where does the Fed play into all of this? Well, you probably saw a few months ago that the Fed changed its policy really related to interest rates. So Before it was really trying to, 2% inflation was really, that was the turning point. And it was actually, if you look at what the Fed chair has done over the last several years, especially Powell just a couple years ago, was the anticipatory effect. If you see inflation approaching 2% and you see a lot of, momentum behind the economy and you see it heating up, kind of the idea has been historically, well, we need to get ahead of that. We need to slow it down. Let's start to raise interest rates, and then it'll cool off. Hopefully we'll time it well enough that it'll cool off and that momentum will slow, and we'll coast into somewhere around 2% inflation. Well, that didn't happen. You probably know the story. Powell raised interest rates, had to lower them again because we started to see the economy, come apart. And so, we've learned some lessons. Hopefully the Fed has learned lessons, and they're really saying, look, this is a terrible crisis. We need to do what we can to get out of this. And we're willing to go big now, and we're willing to let this run for a while. We've had inflation that's been under 2% for quite a long time, with the rare exception that's bounced above and then dropped back down. So we're not going to be so concerned about that. We're going to do a few things here. We're going to say that we need to get to maximum employment. We don't really know what that is, because we thought we knew it was around 5% a few years ago. It didn't turn out to be that. It ended up being somewhere south of 4%. But okay, maybe it's around 4% on average over time. So maybe that's the new level for maximum employment. Just a note, we are currently at 6.9%, so still a long way to go. And then the next comment would be the next policy position is directly on inflation. Inflation has to reach 2%, but then it needs to track above 2%, at least moderately. And so there's another very subjective term. It needs to moderately exceed 2% for some time. Two very subjective terms in that policy statement. So that is not unintentional. It is very intentional to leave them some wiggle room as to make policy changes as they see fit, because they cannot anticipate all the things that are going to happen over the next 2 to 5 years, whenever this might actually come together. So inflation is a big part of this, right? So monetary policy has always been centered heavily on inflation. This gives you a sense, again, from the same model that I was showing you before. What does inflation look like based on spending? So if we don't get a stimulus bill at all going forward, you see the yellow line is basically where we're going to be. And that's, still tracking well below 2% out into 2023, 2024, just a slow growth economy. If we get a relief stimulus that is kind of in the range of 500 billion to $1 trillion, is basically where that is. That's your red line, and that's kind of where we are. That's the base case scenario. Thinking, okay, split Congress, that's the best we can do. That's actually not too bad. You actually get, according to the model, you get inflation above 2% by somewhere in late 2021 into 2022. If Biden got most of what he wants, this Biden light plan is not his verbatim, his plan, that he ran on. This is, okay, Biden will get a fair amount of what he wanted to do, but he's not going to get it all. He's gonna run into some roadblocks, and some of the spending is going to have to be reduced. But this was a pretty robust plan, and so you can see that would actually rocket up in 2021 into 2022, hitting somewhere close to 2.5%. So we're kind of on this path that leads you to where the Fed and other private forecasters are, they kind of link together. And you can see that here, the expectations for monetary policy, for interest rates, basically the overnight rate, the short-term rate for the Fed. And what are we going to, where will we be, say, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? And basically, if you look at the red line, that's what the Fed, the latest dot plot that we have from the Fed is from September. And they're saying, no way, guys, we're not going anywhere. We're signaling to you right now, we are staying at zero bound for a very long time. The long term, whatever that is, if that's 5 to 10 years from now, we'll be off of zero. But when the next 3 to 4 years, we're not budging. Trying to signal to the market, look, you can go out and invest. You can feel safe at lower interest rates. Do what you need to do business wise. Make good decisions. try to stimulate the economy, we'll support you. And basically Oxford Economics is saying the same thing, as is Moody's and S&P and Goldman and everybody else. The market, if you look at the CME actually has all kinds of things where you can trace what will the future look like, and there's it's quite complex of what it actually does and whether it's meaningful or not. But people do watch it. This market does. People that are in interest rate markets pay attention to this, and it responds to what's going on in the economy. It responds to what is the expected spending amount from the federal government and how quickly will we recover from this recession. So actually, it's trending up quite a bit. And so if you think the market is right as opposed to the forecasters, that tells you that we're going to start liftoff in late 2021, and it's just going to take off from there to inching up closer to 1% by 2024. So very different signal from the market than what you're getting from the Fed and from private forecasters. I think this is my last slide. Looking forward to your questions, but this kind of brings together the fiscal side and the Fed side that I talked about. The Fed is really in a tough position. I know this is really busy, but these are a couple quotes that I think really sum up where the Fed is. The Fed has basically recognized we've done our QE. We started a bunch of programs. We're buying all the debt that the Treasury is issuing. We're doing our part, but we have limitations. We have guardrails around what we can do. And taking interest rates negative isn't going to do it. We have lessons from other parts of the world that's probably not going to help. It'll hurt. It'll hurt our financial system more than it probably helps anybody else. So what can we do? And so that's why you start to see these quotes from former Federal Reserve President William Dudley, and then you also are seeing an awful lot of that kind of signaling from Chair Powell as he's gotten out. I mean, it seems like every time he gets up and speaks, it's a little bit more direct that, hey, Congress, you really need to spend a lot of money. And this quote here was a month or so back, basically saying it is very difficult to overdo this. You should go big. And so that's basically the Fed is saying go big because they're concerned that they're out of tools and that anything they do, and if you look at really the strategy behind mixing fiscal and monetary policy works much, much better if it's combined with fiscal policy. If you try and do everything on the monetary side without fiscal stimulus, it has a much lower impact. So that's basically what's going on. The Fed is saying we need help, and it's got to come from Congress. So anyway, the chart that I threw in there is just some of the forecasts looking at Q4 GDP, and that's what a lot of these comments over the last couple of months have been about. That we're gonna, we saw a really good rebound in Q3, not so much in Q4, and what does it look like going forward? That's the real challenge. So I'll stop sharing. Would be happy to take questions. But that's basically the backdrop. The backdrop that Biden will be entering into when he takes office in the third week of January, and he's going to have a whole lot on his plate. We already heard with the last few speakers, a lot of things that he's going to have to take on with climate change. Obviously, climate action being one of the key things that he's already said in multiple ways that's what he's going to prioritize, and across the agencies, and probably won't be able to do as much as he would like to do through legislation, but it's going to come in other ways. So I would say that COVID's going to be his first primary thing that he's going to want to do, and it's absolutely the right thing to do. Is one, try and help put this health crisis behind us for just for personal reasons, to stop the personal impact, but alongside with that, at the same time, he's going to be trying to tackle the economic impact. So those are going to be really the overarching topics for him or issues for him that he's going to take on right away, and then it's going to fan out from there to a lot of other things. So maybe that's a good segue into questions, Glenn.
Great. Well, Dan, thank you for that for the insight you provided so far, and we'll have some. And please submit your questions. I have plenty if you don't come up with any, audience, but feel free to put those through now. We do have one waiting for us now. there's obviously some world economy, and how does the world impact us, good or bad?
Well, currently it's, we've been pretty isolated because of COVID here. Global trade has declined dramatically, so it depends on what vantage point you look at. The world economy not doing well does hurt us on our exports specifically. If you're an export-centered business and, say GDP in Europe goes down, 5-6%, that just means that there's less industry, there's less businesses that are doing well. They probably are slowing down with their ordering. Very similar to what we would experience here. If we had, the slide that we had here, there's probably people buying, I alluded to it before, that there's people buying, very different things. And I wish I had sent, there was a great Wall Street Journal article that talked about this, and it showed how we've seen on some of the most common things we purchase in the US in normal times have declined, purchases have declined by 20, 30, 40% over the last 6 months. And that's largely because we're not doing the same things. We're not living the same lives. So they would experience the same thing overseas. If their GDP is dropping the way that ours is dropping, and you're hit by some of those goods that are not being consumed, they're not being shipped, that's going to hurt you an awful lot. So yes, there's interconnection points for sure. The global economy really does matter. I will say there has felt like a much more insular feel during the pandemic, and certainly over the last 4 years of kind of the go it alone strategy in Washington has been trying to push us a little bit into the insular mode, or at least having some protectionism against what's going on. So I would say yes, there is global impact, but in the COVID days, a lot of the impact is really on domestic services, like you saw on the charts. Our manufacturing has actually come back quite well, and a lot of that is being exported. So that's positive. Again, if you look around at Europe, you look around at other places in Asia, they actually suffered much less than we did. We were all kind of locked up and very careful over the summer, but Europe, as bad as Europe is right now with COVID, they actually had a pretty good summer where they were able to go out and live a normal life. And much of Asia was the same. And so the global economy actually looked quite a bit better for many places than it did here. So it does have an impact whether it swings up or swings down, but to a much greater extent for those that are export oriented.
All right, appreciate that. So I got a two-part question for you. I guess first off, that there's been 2 vaccines that there's been some preliminary information on that both have a pretty significant efficacy rate of over 90%. One's almost 95. So the market immediately had a pretty good positive spike in reaction to the fact that they look promising. So question one is, assuming, whenever it happens, whether it's in early 21 or 22, whenever that is, whenever we get this thing under control, and since you're the one answering the question, you can decide what the definition of that is. How do you see that going? How do you see that proceeding? And then the second question, a lot of the polling, for whatever we can take out of the polling, folks had more faith in President Trump when it came to reversing the economy and fixing that than they did under Biden. How do you see it going with Biden's administration versus Trump? I mean, are we gonna rebound as quickly? How do you see the rebound? And just give us your best impression as how you see the difference would be with Biden in the White House versus if Trump were to prevail under some.
Yeah, sure. So with the caveat that I'm not a scientist, the person that I follow, if you're looking for somebody to follow on Twitter or just in general, I think he's on the news on CNBC or somewhere else almost every morning, is Scott Gottlieb. He does a great job. Used to head up the FDA and is very close to a lot. He's on the board of, I think, Pfizer, and so he's very close to these pharma companies. He does a great job. He's a virologist or epidemiologist by training, and so he follows this very closely, gives a great insight in a lay way that you and I can understand. He's basically saying, look, this is going to be bad for another 3 months. He predicted it back in, very similar to Anthony Fauci, predicted it back in late summer and said, if we don't get this under control now, it's going to get really bad in the latter months of 2020, and it's going to last into 2021. It's going to be much worse than what it is now, and that's kind of playing out now. He's also been talking about the vaccine and when this can actually roll out. I think he's been very impressed with the numbers that came out from Moderna and Pfizer, which gives everybody a little bit of a breathing room. We can at least, look ahead. We've got light at the end of the tunnel. But for many of us, I think the distribution of those vaccines is going to be the hardest thing. We have one vaccine so far that needs to be held at an incredibly low temperature and one not so low, which would be a little easier to transport and to store. But there's going to be logistics issues there. They're definitely going to try and get to frontline workers, as they should, folks that work in hospitals, and then the folks that are elderly, people that are much more prone to get COVID just because of immuno issues or whatever. So once you get out to the broader population, everything that I read from them is probably second into third quarter is more reasonable for us to get to, so that everybody can have the vaccine if they want it. And so one of the concerns, kind of an offshoot, is how many people in polls say they don't want to take it. And I'm hoping that number will come up over time, where people they observe other people taking it, not having, large negative effects, and then say, I really want to be immune from that so I can get back to my normal life. Your second question is on Biden getting into the office and what does that look like? There's no question leading up to the election, I think, the polls all showed that there was a lot more confidence that Trump would perform better as it relates to the economy. The models didn't show that, and I showed a couple of charts in my slide deck related to that, simply because what you started to see as we came through the latter part of 2020 was a reluctance to continue to spend. And that's really what triggers in a big way. Is that sustainable over 10 years? Certainly not. But, when you're looking out over quarters, spending will do an awful lot to boost your economy. And what we started to see was, there was some differentiation in how the Republicans in Congress wanted to approach spending and how the White House wanted to approach it. And so we started to see, we got a couple $1 trillion passed by the House for another COVID bill. And then we went into, to the Senate, and they came up with $500 million. Or $500 billion, I should say. So the numbers were way off, and there was, based on what we were hearing from the cabinet members and those that speak for Trump, it basically was the second term would be much more of pulling back on the reins and being a little bit more cost constrained and getting debt kind of under control, at least trying to trim down deficits. That was the messaging, that was in the plan. And so it's interesting that people felt confident, I think, based on what they had seen over the course of 2016 to 2020, stock market going up, jobs coming back, really low unemployment until the pandemic hit. And I think that carried over. That was kind of the perception that a second term would look just like that, when in reality, when you looked at the plans, they actually didn't show that. So, if you're looking at someone to come out of a recession, you're just saying, get us back on trend, do something, get us back to where we should be. You want to spend, and that's gets down to the differences of ideology between a Republican and a Democrat. Obviously, in general, I should say, Republicans are going to try and pull back a little bit and say, hey, what about the long-lasting debt impacts? And Democrats are going to have a different answer for that. So,
thank you. Got another question came in. With the slowly forecasted economic rebound, what effects do you see potentially with regard to future federal investment programs and infrastructure or funding? So you see an infrastructure bill coming?
Yeah, I do see an infrastructure bill coming. I think it's one of the few things that that both the House and the Senate can actually agree upon. How big that will be is going to be the fighting match. I actually was quite surprised over the course of Trump's first term that didn't get pushed to the front of the line and get pushed through. I think they could have, if they were willing to compromise a little bit, there could have been an avenue there to get that done. I do think that Biden is known as a compromiser. He always has been when he was in the Senate. He's kind of a diplomat type of guy to try and bring people to the middle. That's regardless of how you feel about him, that's what his record has showed for most of his career. And so I think they will be able to get something done. I think it's a prime opportunity. It's a great vehicle for the Dems to use to get their climate action. Brent was dead on. I mean, everything I read, I've been reading. I read through a couple of days ago the USDA memo that he referenced, walking down through everything they do, and almost everything is climate related. And so I think infrastructure gives them the avenue to do that, and also, stimulate the economy and get some things rebuilt that really are in disrepair. Build it back more green, maybe in a lot of ways. Get some green energy out there. Really fix. I'm encouraged to see the water discussion in that document. It's not lengthy, but it's in there, and it does talk about collaboration with the EPA and increasing the size of the water team in the USDA. So I hope all of that happens. We have to do something about reacting to water quality and just paying more attention to it. And I know that's been referenced several times here over the last 2 days, but it's heartening to see that in there. When that actually happens, I'm hopeful that it could happen in 2021, but I'm not confident that it happens in 2021. It might, with all the things that have to be done. And if the Republicans hold the Senate, some of the wrangling of getting appointees in is going to be difficult and take time. And just staffing up could take a while. So I think it's there, but you're sitting behind the elephant in the room, which is COVID and generally the economy. I think following that, you could probably start to get into something related to infrastructure and say, look, this is what we did initially on COVID, the relief fund going out to people. That was one of two. The two of two is infrastructure to try and get the economy going in general, not directly into people's pockets, but let's restore the economy and the infrastructure to where it needs to be.
All right, and it's up to the water community, I think, to make sure that water is included when that funding does come through. That's something that I've been pretty critical of the Obama ARWO program. They had this $1 trillion plus program, and the actual amount that went to water wastewater was like 0.2%. It was futile as far as the actual grant funds that came into our sector. There's another question, although let me see. Is there a concern with legislation of how many independent utilities? Oh, okay. Is there concern with legislation on how many independent utilities there are in the water wastewater industry, especially when EPA draws concerns to ongoing violations to regulations? Concern with legislation on how many independent utilities there are. Well, I read it to
you. Is there a concern about is there the vast number of water utilities that are out there? Is that a concern when it comes down to regulations?
Well, legislation of how many independent utilities there are in the water wastewater industry. So it sounds like do you have any feeling whether that we could legislate some requirements for regionalization and consolidation?
This is outside of my expertise, but working at CoBank for 10 years and being around it, knowing the little bit that I do compared to most of you, I would be surprised if they go so far as to legislate something as far as bringing, encouraging consolidation. I think what ends up happening, reading through those documents, what I walk away with is, okay, there will be EPA and the USDA are going to work together, and it's largely going to be incumbent upon the EPA to regulate more tightly on water quality. And that's going to require more spending to do a better job, more equipment, just doing things in a higher quality way, similar to what we were hearing about today and yesterday. That can't happen when you have 50-some thousand independent water companies out there. Many of them are not going to have the capacity to do that. So I think where consolidation happens, it's probably inadvertent. It's probably not on the minds. I imagine that a Biden administration would want to stay, agnostic on consolidation, but the reality, similar in the sense to what you've seen in agriculture, is a lot of demands on on the folks that are producing agriculture. It's the same way as if you're generating clean water and distributing it. You've got to be able to keep up with what's required of you. And if regulations are going to go up, and we are going to take care of the PFAS problem, and the lead problem is going to continue to get eradicated, and you're going to worry about the folks that haven't been worried about before, and do some more environmental justice type things, that's going to take real money. And Biden has said that he's going to double the amount of money that's spent on water. I don't know if that's enough. I'm just not close enough to it. But I certainly expect that there will be increasing pressure if all of that is done, the regulatory environment changes and it becomes much more stringent, that it's going to apply more pressure. And I would expect that more consolidation would happen.
Right. Yeah. Compelling that is going to be a difficult task for anybody to do. But if they can incentivize it, that'd be the way to go. We're running out of time. There's one more really good question I want to bring to you here. And this is perfect, right in your area of expertise. How do we consider the long-term effects of the runaway federal deficit, especially when you think about these new stimulus packages? If we continue with additional stimulus packages, right? So we're going to do another one here. It's just $500 billion would be the small size. Might be another $2-3 trillion if the Democratic Party gets their way. How do you see that going? How are we going to be able to proceed to be able to balance a budget in the future? And what do you see going forward?
It's a real problem in the long term. It's just, what is the long term? That's always the question. We've been commenting a lot about this on LinkedIn with our CEO, Tom Halverson, has been very interested in this. I listen constantly to different debates going on. Jason Furman, who was from the Obama administration, was debating with someone from the Manhattan Institute last week, two very different perspectives. And trying to decide, one of the big issues on the debate was, where is a sustainable level of debt to GDP? And you would have seen the Manhattan Institute come in somewhere well below 100%, even just a few years ago. And you would have seen this massive gap, just this dichotomy between the two that they wouldn't have been able to match up. Strangely enough, both of these guys debating landed on 150% of debt to GDP, recognizing, look, we're going to have to get through this crisis. It's not going to be gone in 2021. We have to spend our way out of it. And we need to keep in mind that at zero interest rates through 2024 gives us optionality to actually think about this. So Jason Furman's idea was, look, you cannot compare an interest rate environment that was 5, 6, 7%, or even 4% to zero. Our interest payments, obviously it's not zero, right? It's some, when you put together, price out a bond, it's not going to be zero, but at zero interest rate environment, you're going to have very, very cheap debt. And so what we really should be looking at is interest rate to GDP, or interest spending to GDP rather than debt to GDP. And you would see a very different chart there. I don't know that I agree with that. I think that's problematic in the sense that yes, okay, fair enough. The interest rates are very low for now, but when interest rates start to go up over time, it's not like we've locked these in forever. These deals, these bonds that we're selling to pay for what we need to pay for, a lot of it's 5 to 10 year debt. Well, that doesn't last very long, and when you have to renew that debt, it could be sky high, it could be quite a bit higher than what it is now. And so, that I at least was interested to find that they found some commonality, that this is sustainable in this environment up to a certain level if we do spend a little bit more. And I think basically what they were rallying around was, yeah, we should probably spend another couple $1 trillion to get us through this thing. That will get us up much closer to that 150. We're going to blow the budget again in 2021. And then we're going to get somewhere, as we start to creep upwards, we're going to get up there somewhere. And it's terribly hard to do to get that debt down over time. I mean, if you do the pie chart thing, you break down what's actually what can you actually shift? Most of it is Social Security and Medicare, and many of you have probably looked at these categories that are in the budget. You've got the Department of Defense, you've got Medicare, and you've got Social Security, and they make up most of the pie. Unfortunately, unless we want to be really cruel, that's a hard thing to do, is to actually reduce that. So you have to start tinkering with things that no one wants to tinker with, which is, changing, eligibility ages and things like that. And so, Yeah, it's a hard thing. If you look, last comment I'll make is just if you're thinking of it as most of us do, just thinking of it pragmatically and, stepping back and saying, well, this is a tax on our children and our grandchildren. It absolutely is. We are taking capital, we are basically transferring it into taking capital from the future, turn it into the present so that we can spend it, and then the cost is pushed back to the future. And so it's really quite that simple. There are times like today where you really have to do it, which makes it all the more important that when you don't have to do it, you really should be doing it. You should be reducing the deficit and trying to get the debt down to at least where it's not increasing. And we've done really a pretty decent job of that over time. If you look back to the 1960s, we did a pretty good job of that up until about 2017, where we started to spend a lot when the economy was doing well. So that's probably our best bet, is to try and get back on a trajectory that's more more in the line of that, rather than trying to really gouge, or we're just going to lose the momentum behind the economy.
Dan, thanks so much for your time, for your excellent responses to our questions, for the presentation, for the relationship with CoBank. Remember, we have at the top of the hour, which is just a few minutes away, we've got our last session coming up with RCAP and several of our other board members. So we'll see you then. Dan, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate you all. Take care.